Hello, welcome everyone. So just to start off, I would like to acknowledge that the native lands that this current building resides on, which belong to the Muncie Lenape people. I'm also from New York City, so it's also really interesting to learn about the people who used to live here before we did. So my name is Daniel Chen. I am currently a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow at the University of British Columbia. I am also a data science educator at Posit PBC, formerly known as RStudio. And I currently work on their academy team, so it's all education-related work that I do. I've been heavily involved with the carpentries, and I'm also the author of a book called Pandas for Everyone, which I was just told that they've given me copies to give out to folks, so we'll figure some mechanism to give them away. So I'm pretty much usually go to like R and Python conferences and then usually end up talking about the other language. But I do get to say that there are actually almost literally a dozen of our users at this conference today. So it's kind of nice to see. And that's sort of where what this talk revolves around as well. So I'm here to talk to you about Quarto. I am not one of the main core developers of it. I am going to talk to you as a avid user slash someone who's really excited about this tool. And so what is Quarto? Well, if we look at the website, and I'm just going to plagiarize off of their definition. It is an open source scientific and technical publishing site system built on Pandoc. And what's also really cool is it gives you the ability to interweave Python code, R code, Julia code, or Observable, which is JavaScript, all into a single scientific document. So who would really want to use Quarto? So you're either like me, you're a data scientist, you do a whole bunch of work in Jupyter notebooks, so that's either for your analysis, or you're trying to run a report and create some kind of documentation of what you're doing. Maybe you're doing some kind of technical writing, so you're trying to keep a blog of things that might need bits and pieces of code. You want to host a website, either for like a course, a university course, or your own personal website. Presentations like this one that you're looking at is written in Quarto. A lot of documentation for packages like we just saw from the polars. Package maintainers are starting to write books accompanying their libraries now, just as another way to get users acquainted with their tools. So you can also write books using Quarto. And as an academic, one of the other really cool things is when you're writing papers, there's actually a very robust citation system associated with it as well. So if you fit in any of these roles, like hopefully this becomes a tool that you get to look into. This is one of the images that I have from my dissertation, actually. And really the main thing I wanted to point out here is as data scientists, we go through all of this process of getting data, processing it, analyzing it. But really, like, none of that stuff really matters unless we create something for the world to ingest. And then when the world ingests the stuff that we create, do keep in mind that like it does feed back into the world and some kind of consequences, either good or bad, happen. So be very mindful of that. But a big part of that is you need a mechanism to communicate those results. And again, Quarto is one of the tools that you can do to do that. And another thing, so Alison Hill, probably you know her mainly through the R world, but she has this really funny post where like she has more websites than blog posts. And again, that's really because some of the tools that came out from the R ecosystem make it almost too easy to put something on the internet. So it just goes to show how flexible these tools can be. So now the question is, doesn't Jupyter do that? Like I talked about Julia, Python, R, and it's like literally in the name Jupyter, like it's supposed to do this. So the answer is yes, but we gotta talk about notebooks first. So there's this series of talks over the last couple of years, and if you don't know, there's links to them on the actual slide. But there was a talk by Joel Gross in 2018 about things that he doesn't like about notebooks. And then Jeremy Howard replies back like, you know what? I actually do like notebooks. So I do employ you to take a look at those talks just as additional background information. But here's my list of like what I do and don't like about notebooks. So in technical writing, it's actually really nice. I get to do literate programming, so I can interweave code and prose text and describe something of what's going on. But then the problem eventually becomes, I need to edit this, that's not on my computer, and now I'm faced with this giant JSON blob, and I just wanted to put a period somewhere, or like a comma. And now you're editing raw JSON, putting in punctuation marks, and then you are in a world for hurt. As a data scientist, I almost think of Jupyter Notebooks more as an output format, just because figures and tables and results are all in there, which is good. So it's like great when I'm teaching and I'm running a workshop, I can just code along and talk, and then the output is there, and I publish it on GitHub, and it renders, and I don't have to worry about giving my students any of the assets that came out of a workshop. But the second you end up needing a notebook for a collaborative environment, you're back into, okay, here's this giant JSON blob. You hope that there's no image in there that you have to like eventually diff, and it becomes like a nightmare. But the other nice thing that I've noticed from a teaching perspective, there's actually a lot of really great teaching tools around Jupyter Notebooks. So MB Grader is one that we use at UBC. And one of the why I don't like about notebooks is this notion of hidden states in notebooks. And what I've actually found that like if you tell the students that the first thing you do after you run into a problem is just to go restart kernel, run all, that usually fixes a lot of the weirdness that happens with hidden states because students start executing code in the wrong order. So you just tell them like, here's the way to essentially turn it off and turn it back on again. And then you come to me with your question. So that's sort of the workaround that I've done with my students. So, okay, so this talks about Quarto. So Quarto versus Jupyter. So here's the high level, like just what the documents look like. On the left-hand side, you have a Quarto document in VS Code. And on the right-hand side, here's a Jupyter notebook in Jupyter Lab. And again, the first thing you'll notice, okay, so there's these things that look like code in cell blocks or something. But the thing that's missing on the left-hand side here is there isn't like the table output, or there isn't this figure output in there. So that's one of the nice things that I like about using with Quarto documents is like the output isn't embedded in the file. And it is a plain text file, so that's also really nice too. So it really isn't that it's Quarto versus Jupyter. It really becomes like Quarto actually uses Jupyter under the hood. So it's not saying that like one is a totally different tool that you have to just give everything up. If you start off with a Quarto document and if you're rendering or using code that's anything but R, it actually leverages all of the Jupyter ecosystem. So like all of the stuff that you already have like kind of already is there. The only thing that changes later on down the pipeline is it all goes through, creates a markdown file, and then it goes through Pandoc to render into all of the other data, all the other output formats. So this part right here is a little bit different from Jupyter and Jupyter Notebooks that use like Jupyter text, or you have to write is that the markdown flavor? Like my ST. So that's the little part that's a little bit different, but it still uses the whole Jupyter ecosystem. So I don't want to give the impression that it's really like you have to pick Quarto and then you have to give up everything that you've done with your Jupyter notebooks. And then just like as another example, so Jeremy Howard, who runs Fast AI, they actually use Quarto right now. They actually wrote a whole blog post about how they're swapping everything to Quarto, and they're a very Jupyter notebook-centric company in what they do. All right, so let's go and do an analysis so you have an example of what's going on. So this is something that you might do typically as a data scientist. You might load some data. So here's from Python. There is a package called Polymer Penguins that you can use the load penguins function to get data about penguins. And this is a regular data frame. It's got mixed type. You can see that there's some numbers, there's some missing values, and I have some categorical values, et cetera, et cetera. And again, like this is a presentation written in Quarto. And actually when I rendered the presentation, like this is live executing the code that's presented here. So this isn't like a pre-calculated thing. So when I was editing my slides right before I came on the stage, there was also like a risk that something horrible would have happened and not rendered. So, all right, so now let's go do some exploratory work. We can use something like pandas for that. I know like there was just a talk about polars, but here it is. Here's a pandas example. We can run pandas code to get some kind of overall description, descriptive statistics of our columns. And again, this is live executed, so you can see the output, and this is in the presentation format. We can also do plots. So here's a plotting library called Plot9, which is sort of, so I also come from the R world, so this is almost copy and paste from R's ggplot code. And so we can actually visualize what's going on with our data set. And again, the code that we have up here, it can dump the output right below. And then last but not least, we always want to be able to model something, so you can actually, assuming all your packages are installed and you kind of know how to use the modeling functions, we can actually create a model and then pull out some type of the actual coefficients for this model, and then be able to say something about how does mass affect the sex of a penguin. So before I continue, so like I talked about models, so there is a totally separate talk about model ops within this whole ecosystem that Isabel is running tomorrow, I think at the same time today, so I'll just give a shout out to that particular talk. But now like we have like the basic set of things that we want to be able to do as a data scientist. Let's actually go make things. So we can go create what's known as a Quarto markdown document, or QMD, or we can actually copy paste all of the code and put it into a regular Jupyter notebook. So again, either one of these file formats will work. So if you're, again, working already in Jupyter notebooks, go down the Jupyter notebook path, or you can learn how to create a Quarto document. And so the thing that, what's part of this Quarto document? So at the very top, you have a YAML header. So on the left-hand side, like this is the bare minimum of what you need. You just need to tell it what output do you want, right? So it's pretty typical for a lot of these data science reports to be HTML, just so it's continuously scrolling. We don't have to worry about pages or stuff like that. But on the right-hand side, this is essentially the example that I have in the repository. So if you want to take a look at this, these slides, there's an examples folder, and this is roughly what that looks like. So you can add more information, including the ability to keep the intermediate files. So if you really need to like intercept what gets created during that whole pipeline, you can actually say like keep the markdown file that gets generated, or keep the actual notebook file, because you have this whole other process that is Jupyter notebook based, but you just don't want to deal with having the outputs like in line with your file. So there are ways to like keep that stuff, so you can sort of ease your way into this. There's also this line down here that I'll talk about in a little bit. You also need to just say like, hey, like when you want me to render this notebook, like what binary do you want me to use to like execute the non-R cells? So we talked about the YAML file, so then now there is the actual code chunk. So this is a little bit different from what you're used to when you're working with Jupyter notebooks. So this is what a code chunk looks like. Assuming you know how markdown works and you can know how to write the prose text around it, the code chunk looks something like this. Begins with 3 backticks, so that is markdown notation for I'm gonna like treat this as a verbatim piece of text or code. And then you put into curly brackets, and then this is known as the engine. So this is what is the language that you're going to tell Quarto to like execute the code below. So here, this is a Python conference, so this is a Python engine in this code block. And then the other cool thing is with this special type of comment with a hash and a bar and a pipe, you can tweak how that code chunk behaves and how the behavior changes for the output. So here I'm actually saying echo equals true, which means when I go and render this document, I actually want you to show the code. So that also implies that there are ways for you to hide the code. So if you just need a figure without all of the text for how you generated the figure, you can hide that. And you can do that in Jupyter notebooks. You have to, again, edit the JSON file and hope that you got everything correct. But in here, you also get a very quick way to just say, add a whole bunch of other parameters or options to your code. And then the rest of the text that's not in this special comment is regular code. And then so once you have an entire document that you're ready to do, once you have Quarto installed, it is a command line tool. So you can actually run a command called Quarto render, and then give it the QMD file that you want to render. And you'll see here that like it has detected the fact that like there are some cells in here that are not R cells. So it's going to use Jupyter to start finding and executing all of those cells. And then it'll sort of convert everything to Pandoc and then a whole bunch of other stuff. And then you end up with this Quarto HTML file, which I believe that I have open. Yes. So this is what it looks like. Really similar to if you were to export out an HTML file for a Jupyter notebook. So here's some of the metadata information. I had enabled the fact that there's a table of contents, so we can toggle that around. And here's code and the actual output. And this is something that's really nice when you are trying to give a report to someone, but you don't want to look at all of the artifacts in the middle as you're like creating this document. And again, you can do the same thing with the Jupyter notebook. Put your cells, take your existing Jupyter notebook, actually like all you need to do is install Quarto and then just point it to a Jupyter notebook that you have. If you wanted to actually rerun all of the cells from top to bottom, for a Jupyter notebook, you do have to remember to put in the flag for execute. Otherwise, what it will do is just take the Jupyter notebook and whatever you have in there, write it out to the HTML type. That's what we have. So there's two ways where you can, if you already have stuff pre-rendered, you can just use Quarto as like, hey, I want this pretty thing, don't try to execute code. You can do that as well. And the output for this is exactly the same, and it'll give you like an HTML file since that's what we specified. All right, so then that's it, right? Like you have your thing, and then you can share it with other people, and that's really nice. Okay, so you can actually do a lot of other cool stuff as well. So this is not my work, but you can actually put in, use what a new tool, or I guess it's a tool called Shiny for Python, and you can actually embed these like widgets or really dashboards like into a Quarto document. Right, so this is essentially a really simple dashboard that is really good at multiplying things by 2 and showing it to you, but it's in a Quarto document. And this is running Python under the hood, and it's also running it under WebAssembly, so it's just doing its thing. We just came from a talk where Fabio talked about PyScript, and so like everyone went ooh and wow when there was a figure. So here's a figure, and we can again create a dashboard and then straight up embed it into my presentation, and it's all done through WebAssembly. And then for one more example, because I went second, you can actually do this with maps as well. So a lot of other plotting libraries you can do, and again, like this is able to embed all of this stuff into a Quarto document, and then the Quarto document can be rendered into a presentation or something else. So that's all really cool. But that's not my work. Shine for Python is being worked on by Joe Chang and Winston Chang, which are here. And then they'll be out on the booth throughout the next couple of days. Joe is giving a talk about Shiny for Python specifically later today. So if you're interested about how to make these types of dashboards in Python, like, do not ask me questions about it. Okay, so I have to go on a small rant about Python itself, because we are trying to execute a document that needs to go find Python and then like do its calculation and give you results. So this is a really common error that you'll see when you try to Quarto render or preview a document. And really, it's going to say like, hey, I don't know what like this notebook format is. Like, can't find Jupyter, like, go install it. And like, we've probably seen this error before a bunch of times where we're like import pandas, and it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, I literally just typed in those words you told me to type in. So what is going on, right? And so it is sort of like an ongoing joke. It's really there in the R world. But like, so the problem is like, there's this notion of like, where is Python installed and how did we install it? And then if we want a more complicated project, like then we're dealing with environments. So like, it's always a question of like, what am I actually looking at? Or like, when I call Python, where is it? So it is a really big problem that does exist. It has gotten a lot better, but it is sort of like one of those ongoing jokes that other languages like to poke fun of at Python. So there are a couple of really good solutions to this. At PyCon this year, Calvin gave this really nice talk about using PyEnv. So if you're on anything that's not Windows, PyEnv works really well. PyEnv actually does have a Windows thing. It just doesn't have all of the plugins that make it like work really, really nice. But what really saved me a lot of times when I first started data science on a Windows machine was Anaconda. So like these are, I would say, like the two big things that I use day to day. And then just like for completeness, what we use at least my group at Posit, we actually use PyEnv and pipenv to sort of use Python and create the environments. And then at UBC, everything is like Anaconda/Conda based. So how do we deal with that problem? Really, like your best friend in the command line is running which Python to give you the binary of like, this is where my Python is. If you're using something like PyEnv, also there's a command called which versions that actually tell you if you've opened up a virtual environment, what actual virtual environment are you actually in. So once you figured out that like, at least when I call this in the command line and it's pointed to the right Python, what else can go wrong? So there's this other command called Quarto check, and it will again reply back to you what Quarto thinks is the Python that you're using, where the kernels for your instance are. Essentially run this when you go and like post a bug report or you're asking for help. It's a really, really good check, literally in the name, for seeing what's going on in your system. The other important thing for me, this is like that error message literally happened to me because I was in VS Code. And so if you're using VS Code to edit Quarto or create Quarto documents, do remember that VS Code has its own separate option to select Python. So like the terminal in VS Code does one thing, but then like if you click on buttons around VS Code, it is pulling from some other variable for Python. So if you are in VS Code, again, like I think it's Command-Shift-P, type in Python select interpreter, and then pick the right Python you think you've just done. And so that's like the series of checks that I always do to deal with the Quarto can't find the kernel problem. The other sort of difference is when we are working in a Jupyter notebook, typically when we click on File New and then we get to pick a kernel, if you're working with environments, you have to go through this process of like registering this kernel in your environment. You don't really need to do that for Quarto. All Quarto needs to know is like, what is the environment my Python is, and then it really calls like the Python 3 for that environment. So that's where that line in the YAML header comes in. It just says like, it knows what the environment is because you've set it, and then all I do is call Python 3, and then it's already in that environment. So you don't have to run or really remember this command of setting the IPy kernel, installing it, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is activate your environment, and then it will find things from there. All right, so now what about like all the other things that you can do around Quarto? So there is a really nice gallery, and again, like all of this cool stuff that I talked about at the beginning, where there's articles, presentations, documents, websites, books, they're all much, much better examples from what I've like presented myself, and you can always find that stuff in the gallery. And then what can you do? There's actually on the actual website, there is a get started guide, and it really does say like step 1, install the thing. Step 2, what is the main tool that you're trying to use? So if you're starting off from VS Code, there's a separate set of instructions for VS Code. If you're in RStudio, there's a couple of setup things there. Most of us probably are used to just working in Jupyter, so there's another pathway to get things done there. Or you're sort of like me sometimes where I just need a text editor and I'm just gonna copy paste commands into the terminal. That's all good, fair game, and you can do that. Another cool thing that you can do is if you have a simple presentation, one that's not like mine with a whole bunch of Python stuff and examples in the repo, once you create like your index.quarto document, if you enable building sites in GitHub, it will actually auto trigger a CI build that will render your slides in GitHub. So that's actually a really cool thing that you can do. Again, my presentation itself is a little bit more complicated, so you have to actually write the workflow file for GitHub to actually render and deploy. But if it's really simple, that is a really quick way to get something on the internet and then auto update as you're making changes. The other thing that you can do is you can actually go to quartopub.com, create an account. And what that will do is it'll give you a service where you can take any Quarto document that you actually have created, and you can run a command called Quarto publish, and it will build the Quarto document or website or project that you have right now, and then send all of that up to Quarto Pub. So all that really needs is make an account on Quarto Pub. When you run Quarto publish for the first time, it'll sort of ask you a couple of questions like, what is your actual username? Can you actually log in? And then some yes or no questions to set up a YAML file that it uses. But then you get this like website that exists somewhere without having to do much work on if you don't want to set up like a CI instance on GitHub. And then I'll sort of, before I go for like a really quick set of demos or anything, there are a lot of cool things that you can do. So Tom Mock, probably like if you Google Tom Mock and Quarto, there's a whole bunch of stuff that he has created, including a really thorough workshop or a set of materials from a workshop that you can go through. Allison Hill actually gave a talk a couple weeks ago just talking about notebooks in general, the pluses and minuses that you can deal with notebooks. Gordon Shotwell gave a talk recently about comparing Quarto and Jupyter. So I've sort of discussed a little bit about like how the two tools are related. And then finally, at our StudioConf this year, one of the keynotes by Minnie and Julia, they actually talked about how they use Quarto to share, collaborate, and teach, reimagine. It uses one of the NASA OpenScapes projects as the example, so that's a little tie-in to our keynote this morning. And also, it's a really good talk if you want to actually see the demo of how citations work within this ecosystem. So if you're trying to do some type of academic publishing, that's a really good resource there. So I'm going to try to do a really quick demo of how this works. But if you want to take a picture, this is probably the only picture that you would really need. So you can go to quarto.org, go through the Get Started page. There's a series of guides that let you pick like what type of project do you want. For example, if you wanted to create a website, Quarto actually has a function called create project. You give it a name, and then you give it like one of the Quarto types, and it will just pre-populate the boilerplate folder structure and all of the whatever needs to just get started for that particular website. And then all you need to do is say Quarto preview, and then whatever project that's in there will sort of render out. So let me see if I can do that. I am just going to copy paste this stuff. So let's say I do want to go and create a website. I can go into, I'll just do this in my home directory. It will create a file or a folder called my site, and it's going to be of this website type. And I can go into my site, and you can see like it created this YAML file. There's an index.qmd file, so it's pre-populated some of this stuff for us. And then if we want, we can either say Quarto preview. And what it will do is it will find all of the QMD files and sort of just render them out locally. And then you have, again, like a nice little website that, again, everything is a Quarto file. So if you need to embed R or Python code or really both languages at the same time for a particular use case, like you have an ability to do that and disseminate your work. All right, so that is the end of my talk. If anyone has any questions, I guess we'll be open for questions. Just don't ask me about Shiny.
Thank you for sharing about this. I've been meaning to learn for a time. So is it one thing that I noticed is it seems like when you create a document or create something that's kind of tied to a specific type, which strikes me as a different notion than like the notebooks. Yeah, you can export it to PDF, HTML, or whatever, but like the document itself isn't like tied to a certain type. Can you speak a little bit more about
Oh, okay. So let me rephrase the question. Okay, so I have this Quarto document. Is there a way when you render it, there's going to be different output types, but not every single like parameter applies to every output type? Is that like a decent rephrasing?
I maybe I'll take another pass. So if like when you're designing or creating a document, do you have to be very mindful and very specific about okay, this when I look at the Jupyter notebook, I don't know what the end publishing format's going to be, but in this case, do you have to be thinking ahead? Oh, I need to do special stuff because this is going to end up a presentation versus a website or a.
Oh, okay. So do you need to like think a little bit more about like your final output type when you're dealing with a Quarto document? If you're in like the regular data science pipeline, like if you're in regular Jupyter thought process, which is I'm just writing code, I see output, you don't really have to think too much about the output type, assuming that your output type is also what you expect out of Jupyter, which is just a single continuous document. So in that case, no. The only one that can be uh, that might get interesting is when your output type is a PDF, because there is like a LaTeX conversion of stuff that's going on in there. But in the YAML header, there is a way to all of the stuff that you would be able to put into the preamble of a LaTeX file, you can link to it in the YAML file. So if it's like, hey, I need like, I don't know, like my code output to look like this, or my tables need to look like this, and you have a style guide from LaTeX, like there's ways to link that in there. And that would only get called when you actually call the PDF output. And likewise, like if you have CSS customizations for HTML output, like that would only get called when you're doing the HTML output. So there are ways to like tweak depending on the output, and there are like entry points for a lot of it. Your mileage will vary. The furthest I've gotten with the PDF output was I copy pasted my dissertation, put it into Quarto, and see if it like, and then put in like the university's like style guide and see if it rendered. It got pretty far. The only thing that it wasn't able to do when I first tried it was like the Roman numeral numbering for everything before before the actual dissertation started. So that's like the only hiccup that I saw, which is actually pretty good considering like it was a whole like a huge project. The other thing, if you ever end up stuck where you're like, hey, this output's just like a little bit weird or something, you do have the ability again to save out the intermediate type. So you can like manually like that's not the ideal world, but you could like tweak things as needed. So that's actually what I did when I rewrote my an update to the book that I'm going to be giving away. It was written in Quarto. It exported out to LaTeX, and then like I gave that to the publisher with like, here's the LaTeX files. Like you're gonna lay everything out on the page. So wait, there was one person in the back. Oh, okay.
I guess does the QMB file render or QA or not render, but treat you as a markdown file automatically, or does it need to be rendered?
So the question is, is there a way to auto preview the markdown file? Wait, hold on. Does it preview as a markdown file, or do you need to render it? So it does. I'm trying to think. I know in VS Code there is like a preview this thing. So there is like a preview. The file itself is like very markdown-like. So if your editor doesn't support it, you can always like pretend this is markdown. Like at the very worst case, like you drop the Q out of the file extension and just let whatever reader like read the thing. But yeah, but again, like the nice part is like all the output isn't in there, so you don't have to worry about like some random thing just showing up, like cluttering or messing up like some part of the output.
No, I want to follow up on his question. So maybe I missed this. Like, PDF or HTML, continuous output. But if you're doing slides or a book, you want to paginate and separate the slides. How does that happen?
Oh, okay. So now the question is, can a single document work if it's a continuous scroll through view or with slides that have like different pages? I guess that is like one of the cases where you do have to think about what your final output is. The good thing, so I can actually show you the source document for the actual presentation. So this is actually like what my presentation looks like. So we have a YAML header and et cetera, et cetera. The slides are actually like two-level markdown things. So if I really wanted to render this as a continuous document, it'll look pretty decent actually. And it's really just saying like these are just my markers for next slide versus like big header. So if it's something along the lines of like a document that you're using to convey in a meeting or something, or whether or not that be a continuous document or a slide deck, I think like this format kind of works for both. But yeah, it won't really work very well if you're trying to like write a whole book out of it. Having said that, a single file here could be a book chapter, so it could be written with the same like table of content breakdowns of a book. The only difference is people expect to read things in a book. They don't expect to read full slides of text when you're presenting. So like your type and style of writing is going to change, but it will render the thing and create whatever you ask it to. Yep.
It's maybe more of a actually I saw some of the icons for Word, the Google Docs. We do our code documentation.
I have no idea if there's a thing that connects to Google Docs. So I know that it can export to a Word document, and Word and Microsoft, and this applies for PowerPoint as well, you can create a template file that when it renders will at least respect how your headings will look and stuff like that. So I know there are packages that will say like, that are like Google Doc APIs, but it's more like, I already have this thing, can I just export this out to like Google Drive? But I don't think it's like straight up in Pandoc where it can just upload to a Google Drive document. Like you definitely have to like write your own little whatever REST API push command or something to get it up there.
You do includes, like, I guess index QMD is a special case. Can you include another subdocument in this one?
Oh, I haven't tried that. So the question is around like when using includes, which there's two. That's like a loaded term because there is includes in LaTeX world where like you're including like other like sub files or something, but you can also up here in the YAML header include like CSS files or ways that you can do that. So now the question is like, can you do child documents? I believe the answer is yes. I haven't done it yet, but if I am building off of like the people who built these tools, sub documents or sub child files and all of that does work in the precursor to Quarto, which was our markdown, and that works really well, and I've done it. So I will say I believe it does. I just personally haven't done it yet. Oh, okay.
So I guess I'm curious, like how tightly is the rendering of non-R cells to the Jupyter ecosystem? Like you said that you need to specify the Python interpreter. Can you also specify like a custom kernel that the notebook renderer is going to use, like C++ kernel, like Lang or something like that?
Yeah. So the question is, I wrote Python here. Can I like put any of the other kernels? I believe as long as I have it installed, you could. I just know out of the box, it sort of like supports R, Python, Julia, and like Observable / JavaScript, like sort of out of the box. I haven't tested like, for example, I know like, what is another kernel that exists in like JavaScript? Like C++ is one, right? I haven't tried it yet. And it's also because like the nature of the work that I do, like I don't touch that. So I haven't really explored that, but I know speaking with some of the authors, like they did keep that in mind. So there are ways to put that stuff in there. I just don't know how much of that is working in a Quarto document specifically. So I can try after this. I'll try to put together a demo that uses, I don't know, some other language. Yeah.
Also kind of related, does the like code block have to be something that like does it always have to go through a notebook to say like render that code chunk?
The
Put any executable there and just have
Can you just run stuff? Yeah, I think you can. I'm afraid to do it because do I have an example? Hold on, hold on. We can maybe try this. So here's a Quarto document, and maybe we can try this. So your question is like, can I just say this is like bash, and then just say that will work, right? So let's see. Will that actually work? Moment of truth. Here's a live demo without. Oh no! Do I have it to actually execute? Okay, so it should. But yeah, this is probably for me the way I'm looking at it right now. It just doesn't know what bash is as a kernel to run stuff in. Now let me try to think.
Yeah, I mean,
You have to specify Jupyter bash kernel in that, and you can specify.
Yeah, you definitely have to specify some other thing. I know like this Jupyter parameter does have like other stuff you can put in there. Like you can actually give it the kernel and the kernel whatever. There's a whole bunch of other parameters that I almost really never look at because I just run in R or Python. But yeah, so if you do have, and I think like that's when you have to have all of the other kernel stuff like all set up. But I haven't done it. So, but yeah, so there are entry points where you can run arbitrary scripts outside and just incorporate it in. The other thing that I don't know off the top of my head is if you have, for example, like a different language code chunk, does the state in one carry over to the other? Because the really primitive way is like, I just run the thing that you told me in here. Do all your variables exist again when you try to call it in the cell below? Originally, before Quarto and R Markdown, like all of this happened, that was one of the nice things that I really liked about just working in Jupyter notebooks was I can just specify the kernel, and then it could just be like a bash kernel, and I can write like a book or instructions on how to like use Git because it was using bash. So that was like one of the things that I really liked about Jupyter. But now like Quarto's on top of it, so maybe I just write the whole thing in Jupyter and just like render it out into something that's like a little bit nicer for me. Cool. Should we all go to lunch?